You look at the numbers coming out of Detroit, and they tell you everything you need to know about the difference between political slogans and economic reality. And folks, the reality is hitting the pavement hard. We are watching the American auto industry buckle under the weight of a trade war that was supposed to save it, while up north, Canada is doing something that, frankly, Washington didn't think they had the spine to do. They are walking away. I am speaking to you as an independent political commentator who has spent a lifetime watching how power works, and I'm telling you, what we are seeing right now is a fundamental shift in the industrial map of North America. You have Donald Trump in his second term, doubling down on protectionism, slapping tariffs on friends and foes alike, convinced that if he squeezes hard enough, the jobs will come flooding back to Ohio and Michigan. But look at the data. General Motors volume is down by roughly 25%. Nissan is down by a similar margin. Those aren't just statistics on a spreadsheet. Those are assembly lines slowing down. Those are shifts getting cut. And those are supply chains snapping under the pressure of uncertainty. The incentives are all wrong. You cannot build a global industry when your own government treats trade policy like a demolition derby. And here is where it gets interesting, because the assumption in the White House has always been that Canada has no choice but to take it. The thinking goes that the Canadian economy is so tied to the American bumper that if we drive off a cliff, they have to come along for the ride. Well, Canada just looked at the car wreck and decided they aren't getting in. This isn't just about survival anymore. It is about strategy. We saw a remarkably candid interview with Flavio Volpe, the head of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, and he didn't mince words. He laid it out plain as day. When U.S. volumes collapse, Canadian suppliers feel the pain, sure, but instead of begging Washington for an exemption, they are pivoting. Volpe reminded everyone of what happened during the pandemic. When the supply chains broke down then, Canadian factories turned on a dime to make ventilators and medical devices. That was the practice run. Now they are using that same muscle memory to pivot away from a U.S. partner that has become totally unpredictable. They are looking at defense technology, aerospace tooling, robotics, and high-precision engineering. They are taking the best engineers and the best factories in the hemisphere and telling them to stop waiting for orders from Detroit that might never come. This is a direct consequence of competence versus chaos. You look at Prime Minister Mark Carney and you see a leader who understands how to read a balance sheet. He isn't engaging in a shouting match on social media. He is rewriting the procurement rules. Carney said it explicitly. I'm going to focus on procurement from Canada. That is a polite way of saying that the era of automatically buying American is over. For decades, it was natural for Canada to buy from the United States because we were reliable. We were the anchor. But when you have a White House that weaponizes trade policy against its closest ally, you lose the right to be the default vendor. Carney is putting Canadian tax dollars into Canadian factories to build resilience at home. It is the kind of serious long-term economic planning that we are frankly missing down here right now. And it is not just about keeping the lights on in Ontario. It is about finding new customers who actually pay their bills and honor their contracts. Volpe made a point about NATO that should send a shiver down the spine of every American industrialist. He pointed out that there are 29 other countries in the alliance. If Canada has a solution that works for the Germans or the Danes or the French, they are going to sell it to them. Think about what that means. Trump's protectionism has unintentionally opened the door for Canada to become a critical supplier to Europe. If our allies look at the United States and see instability, they are going to look for a partner who can deliver consistency. Canada offers regulatory stability, world-class engineering, and a political climate that still values international cooperation. They are moving into high-value defense and industrial manufacturing, and they are doing it because they have to. They are preparing for a world where the United States is a risk, not a partner. The tragedy here is that this was entirely avoidable. The North American Auto Partnership was the envy of the world. It was built on trust, predictability, and shared economic interests. It made us all richer. But you cannot run a complex integrated supply chain when the rules change every time the wind blows in Washington. Reuters has been reporting all through 2025 that U.S. automakers are delaying new EV lines and warning shareholders about uncertainty. Politico called it a self-inflicted blow to Detroit. When you make it impossible to plan, investment dries up. And while we are stuck in neutral, arguing about tariffs that don't work, Canada is charting its own future. They are building a domestic auto ecosystem strong enough to stand on its own and trade globally. They are betting that reliability matters more than bluster, and frankly, if I were a betting man, I wouldn't bet against them. The United States may be entering a turbulent decade in manufacturing, but Canada has decided it refuses to be dragged into that turbulence. The pivot has begun. You want to talk about political theater? You want to talk about the difference between a polite disagreement and a full-blown brawl? Look at what is happening in Ontario. We have spent decades watching Canadian politicians walk on eggshells around the White House, terrified that if they speak too loud, the Americans might get upset. Well, Doug Ford just took those eggshells and stomped on them. In a week that was already charged with tariff tension, the Premier of Ontario walked out and delivered a line that cut straight through the noise like a thunderclap. He said, "I'll never apologize to President Trump." He went further. He said, "They could put me on a stretching rack. I wouldn't do it." You have to understand the mechanics of what is going on here. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. This was a calculated line in the sand. Ford wasn't just rejecting a demand for an apology. He was changing the entire psychological dynamic of the relationship. He looked at the cameras and said effectively that Canada is done begging. The backstory here is pure political warfare. Ontario purchased airtime on American networks, our networks, to run a commercial that used archival audio of Ronald Reagan denouncing tariffs. Think about the brilliance of that. They used the patron saint of the conservative movement to hammer the current Republican president. The symbolism was obvious, and it hit the mark. The ad generated over 12 billion impressions worldwide and was even quoted on the floor of the U.S. Senate. It worked too well. It got under Donald Trump's skin. The President of the United States, fuming over the ad, suspended trade talks with Ottawa and demanded it be pulled. Insiders called it one of the most severe diplomatic breakdowns of the era. And in the middle of that firestorm, when the pressure was at its absolute peak, Ford didn't blink. He said, "We waited 3 days because it was working." That is not the language of a diplomat. That is the language of a street fighter. Now, you have to contrast this with what was happening at the federal level, because this is where the real story of power lies. You have Prime Minister Mark Carney, who is out there playing three-dimensional chess. His team is pursuing strategic discipline, trying to rebuild trust, calm the waters, and prepare for the massive USMCA review in 2026. Carney is trying to save the furniture. He quietly moved to calm the situation, and insiders say his team even offered an apology to Washington to get the negotiations back on track. That is the traditional Canadian playbook. Smooth it over, keep the lanes open, don't let the ego get in the way of the deal. But Doug Ford isn't reading from that book. He represents the working-class voters in the manufacturing belt who see factories closing and supply chains snapping, and they don't want a handshake. They want a fist. Ford said, "Tariffs don't work, especially with your number one customer." He is speaking the language of populism, and frankly, in this political climate, that language is resonating. There is a fascinating tension here between the Premier and the Prime Minister. You had Carney reminding everyone that international negotiations are the responsibility of the federal government, a subtle way of telling Ford to get back in his lane. And Ford, being a political animal, knew when to pivot. He eventually softened, acknowledging that he's the Prime Minister, I'm there to support him. But make no mistake, Ford didn't retreat. Ontario is still enforcing a ban on U.S. alcohol sales in government-run stores. It is the lone retaliatory policy still in effect. Ford called it an irritant, but said, "We have to stand firm." It is symbolic, sure, but symbols matter when you are dealing with a bully. Ford's assessment of Donald Trump was one of the most honest things I've heard a foreign leader say. He said, "You show weakness, he'll smell it like a pit bull." That isn't an insult. It is a strategic analysis. If you roll over, you get bit. If you stand up, maybe, just maybe, you get respect. This good cop, bad cop routine, whether it was planned or accidental, is redefining Canada's leverage. For decades, the country prided itself on quiet diplomacy. But under a second Trump term, where trade is treated as a weapon and tariffs are used as bargaining chips, quiet diplomacy looks a lot like surrender. Ford's defiance and Carney's calculation are two sides of the same coin. They are testing the boundaries of independence. The polls show a surge of support for Ford among voters who feel abandoned by the polite approach. They want a protector. As we look toward that 2026 review, the question isn't whether Canada will push back, but how. Will they continue to play the patient partner, or will they adopt Ford's tone and meet aggression with aggression? Because as Ford put it, I'll never stop fighting for Ontario and Canadian jobs. That is the new reality. The polite neighbor has left the building, and the United States needs to wake up to the fact that we are now dealing with a country that is willing to fight for its own survival. Conclusion. We are witnessing the end of the era of automatic Canadian acquiescence, replaced by a dual-track strategy of federal diplomacy and provincial defiance that makes the northern border a lot more complicated for the White House. Reflective question: does the combination of Mark Carney's diplomatic, strategic discipline and Doug Ford's populist aggression actually give Canada more leverage in trade talks, or does it risk confusing the message and alienating the U.S. administration further? Call to action. If you want to keep tracking how this shift in U.S.-Canada relations affects the economy, hit that like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think Ford's pit bull strategy is smart or dangerous? You want to know what the temperature of the room is? Look at the streets. We are seeing something in this country that we haven't seen in generations. Millions of people, not just in one city, but in 2,500 demonstrations across the globe, marching under a banner that says three simple words: no kings. This isn't a political rally. This is a primal scream. It is the loudest cry of defiance we have heard against a second-term agenda that looks a hell of a lot less like a presidency and a lot more like a coronation. But let me tell you, this unrest isn't just about who sits in the Oval Office. It is about a system that is snapping. You have a country that is stretched thin, weighed down by tariffs that are crushing the consumer, and a government that has been shut down for weeks. We are entering our fourth government shutdown in less than 6 years. Think about the insanity of that. You cannot run a lemonade stand like that, let alone a superpower. The economic numbers tell the same story, and they don't lie. The International Monetary Fund is looking at U.S. growth and seeing barely 2%. The national deficit has ballooned to 6.5% of GDP. And here is the kicker, the one that should keep every banker in New York awake at night. Gold just hit a record $4,300 an ounce. When gold goes that high, it means the market is terrified. It means investors are fleeing the dollar because they no longer see American debt as a safe bet. Trump's obsession with controlling the Fed, silencing the press, and weaponizing tariffs has turned America's greatest asset, its stability, into a massive liability. The No Kings rallies are just a mirror holding that anxiety back up to the White House. Now, look north, because while Washington is on fire, Canada is doing something very different. They are playing the long game. We saw the headlines about Stellantis moving the Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois. On paper, that looked like a win for Trump's reshoring campaign, but watch what the Canadians did. Mark Carney didn't throw a tantrum. He didn't slap a retaliatory tariff on every American product he could find. Instead, his government quietly dropped dozens of counter duties on steel, aluminum, and industrial products. They issued a 100-page order that removed levies. Why? Because in this climate, escalation is a trap. Carney knows that if you get into a mud wrestling match with a pig, you both get dirty, but the pig likes it. Canada is positioning itself as the steady hand in a volatile region. While Trump is raising walls, Ottawa is keeping the supply chains open because they know that American factories still need Canadian aluminum and Canadian energy to function. It is a strategy of strategic discipline. Carney is betting that by stabilizing markets and preserving access, he gains leverage for the big fight in 2026 when the USMCA is up for review. He is turning patience into power. European and Asian trade officials are watching this, and they see Canada as a model for how to handle a bully. You don't outshout him, you outlast him. The irony is thick enough to cut with a knife. The very tariffs that were designed to crush Canada and bring manufacturing home have actually forced the United States to negotiate terms that look more balanced than before. We need their metals, we need their energy, and the protests in the streets are a reminder that you cannot rule by decree forever. The No Kings movement is a signal that the American public is tired of the chaos, and Canada's quiet defiance is a signal that our allies are tired of it too. We are seeing a North American economy realigning itself, not around the whims of Washington, but around the reality of interdependence. And right now, the only person who doesn't seem to understand that is the guy sitting in the White House. You want to see what a backfire looks like in real time? You want to see what happens when you push an ally too far and they decide to take their checkbook elsewhere? Look at what just happened in New York. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of a microphone and delivered a message that should have every defense contractor in Virginia sweating bullets. He confirmed that Canada is moving forward with a massive submarine contract. We are talking $20 to $24 billion, and there is not going to be a single American rivet in those boats. The list has been narrowed down to two names, the Germans and the South Koreans. No American option, zero. Carney framed it as a matter of efficiency. He talked about the need for a single fleet, shared spare parts, and a common pool of expertise. He said, "There's nothing I see that would suggest that we would have a mixed fleet. But let's be real. You don't need a PhD in political science to read between the lines. When you spend $24 billion on defense and you don't even look at your next-door neighbor, that isn't just a procurement decision, that is a declaration of independence." The details of this deal tell you everything about the new world we are living in. Canada isn't just buying submarines, they are buying an industrial future. They rewrote the rules for projects of this size so that the winner has to deliver clear benefits at home. Canadian jobs, industrial partnerships, and long-term technological capacity. And look at how the bidders are responding. The Germans are offering the Type 212CD, a boat that is already standard for NATO, promising interoperability. The South Koreans are coming in with the KSS-3, a bigger beast with lithium-ion batteries that can stay submerged for 3 weeks, perfect for the Arctic. But here is the kicker. Seoul is sweetening the pot with co-investments in Canadian battery production, LNG, and aerospace. They are offering a whole economic package. They are treating Canada like a partner, not a vassal, and that is the difference. While Washington is busy slapping 10 to 50% tariffs on Canadian imports, these other countries are rolling out the red carpet. This is the consequence of treating trade policy like a shakedown. The White House thought that by imposing tariffs, they would force Canada to get in line and deepen their dependence on U.S. supply chains. Instead, they accelerated diversification. Canada is rerouting billions of dollars toward partners in Europe and Asia. And folks, when you lose a defense contract like this, you aren't just losing the sale. You are losing the 40-year relationship that comes with it. You lose the maintenance contracts, the training programs, the shared technology standards. You lose the influence. A defense program that once would have gone automatically to an American contractor is now a competition where the United States isn't even on the field. The strategic implications here are profound. Both of these submarine options are designed to operate independently, with advanced battery tech that moves away from traditional systems. Canada is telling us that they are prepared to patrol their own waters, including the Arctic, without relying on American hardware. They are joining a European Union initiative worth $1.3 trillion. They are finding friends who don't threaten to rip up the trade agreement every time they want a better deal. It is a pragmatic, cold-blooded calculation. If the United States is going to be unpredictable, if we are going to be protectionist, then Canada is going to hedge its bets. And right now, the German Norwegian option and the Korean option both look a hell of a lot more stable than the chaotic option coming out of Washington. You want to talk about the oldest trick in the book, divide and conquer. That was the play. When Donald Trump announced his program of reciprocal tariffs in 2025, the goal was crystal clear: isolate Ottawa, put the squeeze on them, and watch them fold. The White House believed that if you hammered Canada with duties on steel, aluminum, and copper, they would be left standing alone with no choice but to beg for a deal. Well, folks, I hope someone in Washington is taking notes because that strategy just blew up in their face. Instead of isolation, Canada went out and got itself a partner. We just saw Prime Minister Mark Carney fly down to Mexico City for a whirlwind 36-hour trip, and he didn't come back with a souvenir sombrero. He came back with a strategic partnership agreement that fundamentally changes the geometry of North American trade. This is what happens when you push people into a corner. They start working together. Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a pact to deepen ties in everything from agriculture and energy to finance and public safety. And let me tell you, this isn't just a photo op. This is a survival strategy. You look at Canadian canola producers. They have been getting hammered by tariffs and losing demand in China. But guess what? Mexico's growing biofuel sector is suddenly looking like a pretty good customer. They are talking about building new infrastructure, ports, rail lines, energy corridors to move resources more efficiently. For years, Canada's weakness was its inability to get its oil and gas to market. Now they are looking at Mexico and saying, let's build a way out of this mess together. The timing of this is everything. We are staring down the barrel of the 2026 USMCA review, and everyone knows Trump views that trade pact with deep suspicion. He has threatened to withdraw before, and he might do it again. So what are Canada and Mexico doing? They are buying insurance. They are launching public consultations to figure out where the vulnerabilities are, preparing for a negotiation that could turn ugly fast. They framed this new deal as complementary to the USMCA because they are smart enough not to poke the bear unnecessarily, but don't kid yourself. The intent is clear. If the United States decides to flip the table in 2026, Canada and Mexico are making sure they have their own table to sit at. The irony here is rich. Trump used to use Mexico as a wedge to pressure Canada. Now his aggression has created a common ground that didn't exist before. He has forced smaller nations to adapt quickly or die, and they chose to adapt. Canada and Mexico are positioning themselves to present a united front. They are saying that North America is bigger than just the United States. What was intended as economic punishment has reshaped the map. You have Ottawa and Mexico City standing side by side, proving that the tariffs designed to break Canada's confidence have only strengthened its resolve. The backfire is complete.